Hi, everybody. Welcome to, excuse me, the Statistics Solutions Chapter 1 webinar. Just a couple notes before we get started. We have a co-host on, Sarah, who can answer your questions if you have questions that are not related to the content of the webinar. We also, and she's also putting links up where you can access this webinar and other webinars on our website. They're archived, so you can access, again, this webinar and other webinars there. Also just links to resources that we provide. Okay. All right, so let's get started. The chapter 1, which is the introduction, and here's what we will be covering today. Introduction, background, research problem, purpose, theoretical framework, definitions, significance. Other sections, there's a few that I've kind of squished together because some schools require them, some schools don't, and the summary. Yeah, so first, before we just kind of pull back and get an overview of what the chapter is and its purpose, and then we'll go into discuss these sections. You always, if you're at the beginning, if you're starting on the chapter 1 or you're about to, go ahead and, if you haven't already done so, obtain your school's template for the dissertation and for the chapters. If they don't have a template, usually they do. If sometimes they don't, see if you can get an example from your school or an example from your chair from your school that's close to what you're doing, so you can use that as a guide. That's because even though these sections we have here they're pretty standard and they're pretty typical, sometimes schools will have minor differences. The headers may be arranged in a different order, or they may call them something different, or sometimes schools will have more or they'll have fewer. But it's always best to get your school's template, because that will show you exactly what they're looking for. Okay. So the introduction to the introduction, right? So yeah, just pull back a minute and look at the chapter, the purpose of the chapter and the larger scope of the dissertation. It is the introduction, and it's if you think of it as kind of like the blueprint for your study, right? It's going to lay out the what, the why, and the how of your study, right? The what, that's the topic, what you're studying. It's also going to talk about the why, why you're studying, what you're studying. That kind of corresponds to the research problem, right? Why is there a need for your study? You're going to talk about that. And the how, you're going to talk a little bit about the methods. The methods get a full treatment in chapter 3. But usually there is some discussion of methods in the chapter 1, a little bit of talk of, your research approach, your research design, why you chose this design, how it's good for your, appropriate for what you're looking to find out, maybe a little bit about your setting and your sample and your participants. But again, that's all really detailed and worked out in chapter 3. So the introduction, chapter 1 introduces your readers to the what, why, and the how of your study, the topic, the research problem, and some of the methods. And it's kind of a blueprint, right? It's gonna say, here's what I'm going to do in my study. Here's what I'm going to focus on. Here's how I'm going to conduct it, and here's why it's important to conduct. Okay, so that's the purpose of the chapter 1. And then we have these sections, the introduction of the chapter, right? This is going to be the introduction to the chapter, the introduction again of the chapter 1 of the introduction. So it's best to just start off with, all studies stem from problems, right? Like, and usually it's some kind of organizational problem or a social problem. Let's just take an example. If it's education, which are, a certain kind of organization, it could be something like special education teachers are leaving the field. They're there's a high rate of attrition in special education teachers. That would be your organizational problem. You would start off with that, right? You would start off identifying what the problem is that you're investigating. Use statistics. Sometimes it's helpful to use statistics. Here's the rate that special education teachers are leaving. Here's how many there were this year, but now in 2023, here's how many there are. There's a decreasing trend. So use statistics to help make that point about what the problem is. And of course, your statistics in this case should be as recent as possible, right? Because if you use statistics from 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we don't even know if that's a problem anymore, right? I mean, that shows you what was going on at that time, but it doesn't tell you what's going on now. So if you use statistics, make sure they're recent. Or you can use a peer-reviewed source, but something that's anchored, right? Anchored in statistics or anchored in a source. So introduce that problem. You want to introduce also the research problem, right? What your study is, what you're going to do, and the two problems are a little different, right? You have the social or organizational problem, and then the research problem. They're related, but they're a little different. So if the organizational problem is that special education teachers are leaving the field, the research problem is what kind of research do we need to understand and explain that? And we'll get more a little later into what a research problem is specifically. But at this point, you should introduce, what the issue in the research is, or the gap in the research, right? Why is your study needed? So there's two kinds of things going on there. Introduce the organizational or the social problem. Introduce how your study is designed to get information that will help address that problem. And usually the introduction, this is going to sound counterintuitive, but bear with me because it makes sense here. Sometimes you have to kind of leave the introduction alone at first, like don't start with the introduction. Or if you do, kind of have a placeholder, knowing that you're going to come back and revise it. Because if you think about it, it's hard to introduce something until you've written it, right? So my suggestion is kind of do what you can with the introduction, work out the other sections, and then you figure out better what you're doing and how, and you get the details down, and then you can go back to the introduction and you say, okay, yeah, now I know what I'm doing. I'm going to introduce it. Here's the problem, here's the organizational problem. Here's some of the research that's been done on it. Here's the research that still needs to be done. And that's what my research is going to be, that my research is designed to address that problem. So in other words, if you have to let the introduction hang for a little while and then just come back to it, I think that's completely fine. Okay, so the introduction should also state what is needed to address the research problem, how your study is designed to address the problem. So at the end of the section, I mean, everything isn't going to be worked out, obviously, because it's a small section. It's about a page, maybe less than a page. But at the end of the section, your reader should know what you're studying and why. They should have a good idea of that. And you can end the section maybe with a preview of the sections of the chapter. This chapter will include sections on the theoretical framework, the research problem, the purpose, etc. And in addition to your template, which is you need to have just to see what your school is requiring, I also strongly recommend an example of a completed dissertation from your school. So just so you can see how people have handled these sections, what they're including. Sometimes there's just no better guide than an example when you sit down to write. Okay, the next section is the background, and all these sections kind of flow logically. Excuse me. The background is, think of the background as, you're catching your reader up on your topic, on what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? So it's going to be historical to some extent, and it's going to kind of move chronologically and move up to where we are now, as far as your topic goes and as far as the research on the topic. So it's, how long is it? This is going to be a few pages. 3, 4, 5 pages maybe. And the idea is to kind of focus on, not only where the organizational problem is, where it's been, when did this kind of trend in attrition for special education? When did it start? How has the trend been going throughout the years? It's also a background on the research of the problem. And what we found is folks are usually pretty good at getting the reader up to speed on the background of the problem, right? The problem itself. But they tend to forget about, it's also a background on the research on the problem, right? So here's the problem. Here's where it's been throughout the past few years. And you also want to follow that up with, the research, right? So you want to note like trends in the research. You're kind of telling a story, right? A background, not a fictional story, obviously. But you're telling a story of the background of the research on the topic. Before people focused on a certain aspect of the topic, and then research kind of shifted over, and now researchers began focusing on something else. So you're kind of giving contours of the trends in the research, as well as the problem. Okay, and so this ends up where, the background, it should culminate, it should end where, with your study, right? With the need for your study, which goes into the research problem. So there is some historical material again, and you don't need to get like in really real specific detail with each of the studies, but again, it's kind of more of a summary of the studies and the major research on the topic. Again, if you just think of the purpose of this section as getting your reader up to speed on the topic and the research on the topic, that's a pretty good guide. Okay, and then that's kind of funnels into, right, it ends, the background section ends to why your study is needed. Here's where the research stands now, and hence the need for my study, which leads into the research problem. And let's just take a step back for a minute here and just kind of make sure we all understand what a research problem is, because I found that people go, yeah, okay, I get what a research problem is, and then you kind of push them a little more, and they're like, it's hard to define. But a research problem is just like it sounds. It's a problem in the research, or some kind of issue in the research, right? Something that's unresolved or something that's unknown. We have, so the research problem can take different forms, right? Sometimes it's a gap in knowledge, like we don't have knowledge of a certain topic from a certain angle. So there's a gap in the research. Now, not all research problems are gaps. That's one type of research problem. Another research problem could be, we have a lot of qualitative research on why special education teachers leave the field. We have a lot of interviews, a lot of in-depth, their experiences, but we don't have much quantitative research that's confirming, relationships between constructs or something. Or it could be the reverse. We have a lot of quantitative research, but we don't have much qualitative research. Hence, we need more qualitative research and more research digging into their experiences. So that's another type of research problem. Like the methods could be kind of heavy in one area and light in another area, or maybe it's that special education teachers of a certain group are leaving more than another group, and we don't have information on that group, right? Maybe it's by race, or maybe it's by gender. So that's another thing, populations, right? We have information on this topic, but we don't have it about this certain population. So that's another type of research problem. So that's what the research problem is, and really the research problem is important because it drives your study. Right, it's the why, basically. It's the why you're conducting your study. There's a need for research on this topic because whatever it is, there's a gap in knowledge. We've only used one theory to understand something. We need to use another theory to help explain the topic or the phenomenon. And that's what your study is built on. The need, based on the research of what's been done and what hasn't been done. Your study then is designed to fill that need, whatever it is, that identified research gap or that research problem or that unresolved issue in the research. That's what the research problem is. So it transitions from the background, right? So if you think about the background is getting your reader up to speed on the topic, okay, here's what's been done. Yeah, here's how the research has kind of moved through time. Here's where we are now, and we still don't know this, or we still don't have research from a certain angle. And that's your research problem, right? And that's what it leads into. And the research problem section itself, again, not very long, a page, maybe 2 pages, really shouldn't be longer because the research problem should be tight. It should be focused. I mean, I can always tell if a study lacks focus if somebody's going on for like 4 or 5 pages in the research problem section, because it seems they can't identify, or they're having a hard time identifying what the research problem is. So the section is really a more targeted overview. It's kind of like the background, but it's a little more condensed. It's more targeted to what you're doing specifically. And it tends to focus on more recent research. Because the background is going to give you the historical stuff. The research problem is going to target more of the recent research that shows that yes, there is a problem now. It specifically states the research problem, and it states that your study is designed to address the research problem. Okay. The purpose, there's going to be talking about 2 things. The purpose statement, which is a 1-sentence, basically encapsulation of what you're doing in your study, and the purpose section itself, which is probably less than a page, a solid paragraph, maybe 2. So the purpose statement is important because this will, once you get the purpose statement down and it's approved, your chair's on board with it, it doesn't change. It's like your research questions. It doesn't change. So the purpose statement has a very specific construction usually, and I've given you an example here. So it usually says the purpose of this, whatever the approach of your study is and whatever design of the study is to examine or explore the concepts or variables in your study in sample setting. So I have a couple examples here. So a quantitative example would be the purpose of this quantitative correlational study. That's the approach, quantitative design correlational study, is to examine variables or concepts, which would be transformational leadership and emotional intelligence and whatever sample and setting you're looking at. Let's just say middle managers in organizations in the Northeast United States, something like that, whatever your sample and your setting happen to be. And that's it. I mean, but it's an encapsulation of what you're doing, right? And the verb, when we have examine here, the next example I have explore. It's not real important, but usually quantitative studies are usually use something like examine or investigate. Qualitative studies tend to be more exploratory, so a verb like explore works better for qualitative studies. And that's your purpose statement, and that doesn't change. So that means if you have to talk about your purpose statement later in the chapter or later in other chapters, that means you copy and paste your purpose statement. It doesn't change. Now, that the purpose statement and the research questions are the only time you can do that. The research questions are the same way. Once they're approved, they shouldn't change. You don't get a pass on anything else, just those two things. So if you had a paragraph and you're like, this is a good paragraph, I want to use this later in another chapter, and you copy and paste, that doesn't work. Professors will frown on that. But again, the purpose statement itself, they do expect it to be, and the research questions the same every time you mention them. Okay, so that's the purpose statement. Really specific construction. And if you do something like that and it's accurate to what you're doing, you should be fine. The rest of the purpose section can contain things, usually contains specific information about your variables. Okay, such and such will be my independent variable. This will be my dependent variable. Information about your major concepts for your instruments. Here's the instruments I will be using to measure whatever it is you're measuring. And so that's the purpose section, purpose statement, and then some more information about these items. And again, if your template says they want something else, of course, you would add that. Okay, the research questions usually come next. Again, it's dependent on your template, but this is pretty typical. This is not a methods seminar, so we're not going to go into depth about how to develop research questions. We do offer webinars, methodological webinars where research questions are covered. So I would, recommend that if you wanted to find out more about developing your research questions, check our schedule for methods webinars that would cover those. Okay, but needless to say, we understand what they are. They're the guiding, questions for your investigation, right? They are the questions that are designed to get the information that you want to get. Next usually comes a theoretical framework, sometimes called a conceptual framework. And there is a difference, so I'll get to that in a few minutes. So what is a theoretical framework, and what is the difference between a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework? And we'll talk a little bit about it, the overall section in general. These are the theories or the concepts that kind of guide your study and help explain the results, right? They're kind of like the theoretical or the conceptual basis. Because without that, let's just say you're doing a quantitative study, you're going to measure, what did I have earlier? The relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence. You get your results, and yeah, these things are related or they're not related. Okay, so what? The data itself doesn't have any explanatory capacity, right? So that's what theories do. Theories explain things, and concepts too. So, when you get your results, you're going to use your theory to help you explain those, right? Okay, so there's a connection between transformational leadership and between emotional intelligence. What do I say about that? You go to the theories, right? What do the theories say? And the same thing with the concepts. And it kind of, they help guide your study too, the theoretical framework. Now, and sometimes, a theoretical framework can be composed of one theory, it can be composed of two theories. My suggestion is always to have it as streamlined as much as possible. These theories need to actually connect with your study. You just can't kind of pick a theory, oh, this theory sounds good, I think it might be okay. Usually for quantitative studies, the place you look for your theory is the instruments, right? So if you're using an instrument for emotional intelligence to measure emotional intelligence, one of your theories for your framework is going to be a theory of emotional intelligence, right? And it kind of depends on the theory, the instrument you're using, right? Because there's several instruments to measure emotional intelligence. Which one are you going to use? Well, it depends on which instrument is best designed to get the information you need. Okay, great. I've chosen Goldman's instrument to measure emotional intelligence. Well, I'm going to use a theory of emotional intelligence. Okay, I'll use Smith's theory of emotional intelligence. That sounds good. Wrong. You would want to use Goleman's theory, because all these instruments have theoretical foundations. They all come from theories at some point. So if you're using Goleman's instrument, you're going to want to use Goleman's theory, right? Because the theory is going to match the instrument, right? He may have certain components that he defines emotional intelligence by 4 components, but Smith has 5 components. You know, he's added something, and so his instrument is going to be different. So you see what I mean? You want your instrument, your theory should come from your instrument, and it should match. Whoever developed your instrument, the theory should match the theory that you're using. And let's say you're doing that study on emotional intelligence and transformational leadership. Then transformational leadership would be the other part of your theoretical framework, right? So your theoretical framework would include 2 theories, theory of transformational leadership and theory of emotional intelligence. And that's it, right? So it's not, sometimes people really get tripped up with the theoretical framework. What is it? You know, what do I include? But yeah, if you're doing a study like that on those 2 constructs, those 2 theories would comprise your theoretical framework. And again, make sure the instruments match the theories. A conceptual framework is usually, I just take a real practical approach. The theoretical framework is usually associated with quantitative studies, and the conceptual framework is usually associated with qualitative studies. And that's because qualitative studies usually work inductively. That means you're looking to get details, and then you're going to draw conclusions from those details. Quantitative studies usually work deductively. You have a general theory. Then you're going to, you know, look at a certain population, ask questions, and then see if the theory applies to the specific population, right? Whether it works with that population, it helps to explain that or not. You're going to kind of test the theory. So it's a general theory applied to the specific answers. Qualitative is the reverse. You have specific answers, and then you draw conclusions from the specific feedback from your participants, right? You're going to dig into their experiences, into their perceptions, ask them questions, in-depth questions, right? You use those details to then draw conclusions. So for qualitative studies, you don't want an overarching theory, right? Because that's going to kind of work against the inductive approach. You want the kind of the details of the people's experiences to kind of speak for themselves in a way. So concepts are better for qualitative study, concepts or a conceptual framework. And the idea is the same, is that, but you're not using theories. Obviously, you're not using instruments either. You're going to use concepts. So if you're studying, say, something like barriers to advancement for African-American women in higher education, who work in higher education. You're going to have to find some concepts from the literature, pull it from the literature about things like barriers and things that facilitate advancement and things that hinder advancement. You won't have an overarching theory for that, but you'll have, you know, concepts about that you can pull from the literature that will act as your conceptual framework. And that's kind of the big difference between the two. So what goes into the section? Well, you're going to want to define the theory or define the concept at the very beginning, right? Or just state in a simple declarative sentence that transformational leadership and emotional intelligence theory will serve as the theories for my theoretical framework, or will serve as my theoretical framework. Then you want to define the theories, right? And take each one separately. If you have 2, you know, have a subsection for one, have a subsection for the other one. Define the theory, right? And theories are designed to explain things. Define it, talk about who developed it, talk about what researchers have used it for, talk about what was developed to explain. And then, you want to connect it a little bit to your study, how it relates to what you're doing. Right. So after you get that kind of general information about the definition and who developed it and what it was designed to explain, how researchers have used it, you want to get specific about how it connects to your theory. And this is a good section too to look at examples, right? Because it's kind of a tricky section when you sit down to write it. Even though it may sound simple when I'm explaining it, it can get a little tricky, but it's not all that difficult once you kind of get your head around it. All right. What's next? Well, I meant to say too, I'm sorry, at the very beginning, if you have questions as we go along, we'll have a question and answer session at the end. But if you need to jot questions down in the question and answer box or the chat box, so you don't forget them, that's of course fine. Next usually comes a section that's usually titled something like Nature of the Study or Study Design. And it's another methods section. And again, this is not a methods webinar, so we're not going to go in depth on it, but we'll talk a little bit about it. Again, check what we offer in terms of methods webinars to if you have more questions about this. The nature of the study, this is, you're going to talk a little bit about, the rationale for the selection of your design. Why did you select the design you selected? Summarize the methodology. Usually includes things about who you're going to collect the data from, how the data will be analyzed, maybe your sample, your setting, your population, methods concerns. And again, this is a section in the chapter 1, and in chapter 3, your methods completely gets, that's a blown up in detail. The methods you'll have, that section will have all that worked out further. Chapter 3. Okay, usually definitions comes next. Definition section, and this is where you're defining terms that are specific to your study and to the literature, the research that you're engaged in. And I have to say here that definition, this is a section on definitions. They're definitions, not discussions. I've seen people do this where they say, well, so-and-so defines this concept this way. But hold on, somebody else defines it this way, and somebody else defines it this way. There is no universal definition of this concept. No. Again, these are definitions. You're supposed to get these definitions down for the way that you're using the term or the concept in your study, right? So they're not discussions. They're definitions. They should be concise. They should be brief. They should include the things like the variables, your study variables in your research questions, the major concepts, things that are specific to what you're investigating. The section itself is basically just the words and the definitions. You don't really need more of an introduction than the following terms are defined for use in this study. That's really all you need. And then you start defining the terms. Sequence them alphabetically. Do not sequence them. Just don't put them in there randomly. Sequence them alphabetically. I recommend that definitions be in the form of sentences. I mean, that's not always a hard and fast rule. Sometimes it's dependent on your school. It's dependent on your chair. But usually they like them in the form of sentences instead of phrases. And I just go ahead and recommend to put them in as sentences at the beginning, so nobody comes back and says, hey, put these into sentences. Definitions should be clear and succinct. Succinct means brief, to the point, concise, clear. One sentence usually will do it, maybe two. There's really not much need to go past that. Definitions should come from the literature on your topic. and they should be supported with peer-reviewed sources. Absolutely under no circumstances, no dictionary definitions. These are not general definitions. These are definitions from the literature. They need to be supported with peer-reviewed sources. Sources should be recent when possible. Yeah, that's not so important here in the definitions. It's really important in the research problem section, not so important here. But I just recommend, where possible, everything should be as recent as possible, unless something's historical, unless, you know, you're like in the background section, you're doing a kind of a historical narrative. That's all fine. But or unless something's foundational, it's a really important study that, you know, happened in the 80s or something, you know, that's fine. But generally, you know, it's a current research problem. It's a current study. It needs to use current information for the most part. Okay. And that's really it for the definition section. Okay. Significance section. Sometimes there's a section called significance or implications. Sometimes it's called implications. And this is what professors like to call the so what section. So if you're doing a study on why special education teachers leave the field, so why should I care? So what? And they're being a little bit glib, but the point is to get you to think of how the information will be valuable and to whom it will be valuable, right? Because just getting information, it has no value to anybody or no reason to get it. I mean, that kind of defeats the whole point. So how will your findings be significant? Usually there's two prongs, right? To research and to practice, right? So what are the significance, you know, what's the significance of your findings, or what might be the implications for research? In other words, how might your findings contribute to the research in the field, to the literature in the field? And it's kind of forward looking, right? Because you don't exactly know yet what you're going to get, but you should be able to talk about, well, it's going to give us information, you know, if it's special education teachers leaving the field, it's going to give us information about why they leave, what is driving them out. You know, it can add that material to the literature, those kinds of understandings of the topic to the literature, right? It can extend our understanding of, we know they're, you know, it's a high pressure job because, you know, they're not paid. They deal with, you know, behavioral issues, maybe that general education teachers don't. The pay is low because of what they have to deal with. So we know that, but we also know these other things. We might know other reasons, right? So it can extend the research that way, extend the literature. And then the other prong is the value to practice. Okay, how might your findings inform people at the level of practice? Well, if you have information about why special education teachers leave the field, I mean, that's going to be real valuable to administrators, right? Oh, hey, you know, they leave because they're not supported. Okay, they leave because they don't have proper training. So what do you think they're important to administrators? Oh, we need to support them. We need to get them professional development, you know, we need to pay them more, maybe. So that's the significance, you know, for practice. It could also have value to teachers themselves, right? See how, you know, other special education teachers, what they're experiencing, what their reasons for leaving are. So you know, two prongs, how your findings can add to the research or extend the research, and how your findings can give valuable information to people at the level of practice. Okay. Other sections, like I said, I kind of squished these together. Some schools have them, some don't, some have some of them. Usually there's a limitation section, assumptions and scope. Sometimes they do or they don't. Limitations is really again, this is like forward looking. You're not really sure what's going to, crop up that's going to affect a study, but you can kind of, give an educated guess. So this is limitations is where you discuss potential weaknesses or shortcomings that may affect the results. For quantitative studies, big limitations are, can you get enough can you get enough people in your sample? Because if your sample is too low, it's underpowered, that affects the statistical certainty of your results. How do you know if you're going to be able to get enough people? Well, sometimes if it's a small population anyway, or if maybe it's kind of a risky population for some reason, you may think that you may not get enough, so that would be a potential limitation. Potential limitations for qualitative studies, researcher bias. If you're too close to something, you are a teacher and you're studying teaching, you may be close to it. And there are ways to kind of set aside your biases. There's actual strategies. So, researcher bias, it could be a limitation. You would note that, and then you would also talk a little bit about ways that you plan to prevent or reduce that researcher bias. Sometimes social desirability bias is a kind of participant bias. Sometimes participants will answer in ways that put them in a positive light rather than answering truthfully. That's called social desirability bias. And that happens with, studies. You can kind of not predict, but kind of guess, studies that are maybe a little sensitive about, sensitive issues, drug use, maybe things like that. People may not want to be forthcoming. They may answer in ways that put them in a different light. So that's a possible limitation. Again, if you think that is, you would kind of put that out there and explain that. Assumptions are things that you have to assume to be true because you do not have control over them. And the big one is usually you have to assume that people are going to answer truthfully. You can't control what they say. You have to assume that they're going to be honest and they're going to be open. That's a major assumption. Scope, delimitations. This is really like it sounds. It's the scope of your study, and it's going to sound a lot like the purpose. You're going to want to talk about who your participants are, what your setting is, how many participants you're going to have. Sometimes it's the limits that you put on your study. It's the boundaries of your study. In other words, right? You're going to be looking at these things and not these other things. Sometimes it's helpful, like in an education study. Let's say you're going to, just focus on parents. You're going to like interview parents or give them surveys, but not students, not teachers, not administrators. So sometimes it's helpful to put the boundaries around that. Here's the people I'm going to be, studying, and what in what setting. It helps kind of define those boundaries, and that's really all that section is. Okay, and here we are at the summary, and just like any other summary, you're just going to recap major points of the chapter, right? And it's always good to remind the reader of your research problem and why your study is needed. And if you want, you can end by transitioning to the next chapter, which is usually the literature review. And this is information about who we are and our contact information. If you think you want to talk to somebody about, what we do and what we offer, of course, feel free. And does anybody have any questions about the chapter 1 or anything in the chapter 1? Nobody? Everybody's good with the chapter 1? If you have questions, just type them in the the question and answer box or the chat window. I see a hand up, but can you type your, yeah, okay. Okay. Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, any question? If you have questions, just type them in the question and answer box or the chat box. Okay. How would one apply this to a 3-paper instead of one big dissertation model as in one academic paper? Yeah, I don't think if you were doing the 3-paper model, you wouldn't have a chapter. Yeah, you wouldn't have an introduction chapter for all of them. I think your introduction would be, you would have an introduction to each paper and they would just introduce what you're doing in each one of those papers. So it would just be a smaller introduction. Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be the introduction to a 5-paragraph, big dissertation. Would be the introduction to what you're doing. So I think probably very similar, but just kind of shrunk down to that one paper. And then your next paper would have its own introduction and the next paper would have its own introduction. Does that help? Okay, you're welcome, everybody. Any other questions? All right, we do. Let's see, did I get all the questions here? Yep. Yeah, assumptions and scope. Yeah, the assumptions and the scope. Yeah, again, the big assumption is there may be other assumptions that are related to specifically to what you're doing, but the big one is that you have to assume that they're going to answer honestly. And scope, remember, it's just like the boundaries of your study. It's going to sound a lot like the purpose, like who are the participants, what are you doing, what's the setting, and those are not long sections. They're a paragraph. They're usually pretty short. And also for those sections that are kind of always unique to your study, just kind of look at examples of what other people have done to get an idea of how you can kind of translate that information to what you're doing precisely. And the introduction, last paragraph, support to give summary of your methods, right? Do you also have to include major results? No, because you won't have your results yet. This is just the chapter 1, the introduction. You shouldn't have results until you do that, the data collection. Okay, great. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you everybody for attending. We do offer other webinars on other topics, so just check in on our website and check the calendar out, and we do archive these, so they'll be there too. Great, thank you everybody. Have a good day. Take care.